Walk into any Walmart on a Tuesday afternoon and look closely at the canned goods aisle. You won't see dramatic yellow caution tape. You won't find handwritten cardboard signs apologizing for empty shelves, nor will you see frantic shoppers filling 5 carts to the brim. On the surface, the illusion of total modern abundance remains completely intact. But if you look at the net weight printed in tiny white text at the bottom of the label, or if you track the precise shelf space allocated to the cheapest store brands over the last 6 months, a radically different picture emerges. Something quiet, systematic, and deeply unsettling is happening right in front of millions of shoppers every single day, and almost nobody catches it until the money in their account runs out before the end of the month. The budget emergency brake of the American household is failing. For generations, canned food wasn't a culinary luxury, it was an economic guarantee. It was the absolute floor. When fresh beef spiked, you moved to canned stew. When fresh poultry outpaced your weekly budget, you bought canned chicken. When everything else felt uncertain, you filled a pantry with shelf-stable staples that could sit undisturbed for 5 years. That entire safety net was built on a simple, unspoken promise: high caloric density, bottom-tier pricing, indefinite shelf life, and total supply chain reliability. Right now, that promise is being dismantled simultaneously across 15 separate, essential product lines. This isn't a temporary glitch or a brief post-pandemic logistics hiccup. It is a compounding, multi-front squeeze driven by 3 distinct structural forces hitting the global food system at the exact same moment. We are watching a historic crash in domestic cattle herds down to levels not seen in decades, severe avian influenza outbreaks triggering mass depopulation events across southern poultry farms, tightening international fishing quotas in the Atlantic, surging ocean container rates across Asian trade lanes, and a relentless spike in the cost of the industrial rolled steel required to manufacture the cans themselves. When those forces hit premium items, manufacturers simply raise the price tag and pass the cost along to high-income buyers. But when those forces hit the cheapest items on the bottom shelf, there is nowhere left to buffer the impact. There is no lower product category for a struggling family to downgrade to. The safety net has hit the concrete. To keep the system moving without triggering public alarms, food conglomerates and retail giants have adopted an invisible playbook. They know that if a can jumps from $2 to $4 overnight, consumer resistance spikes and alarm bells ring. So instead, they execute a quiet, step-by-step retreat. They trim a 12.5-ounce can down to 11 ounces, while keeping the external dimensions of the metal container identical. They adjust internal formulas, substituting broth, gravy, and cheap fillers for high-grade protein. They phase out low-margin regional brands and fill that newly empty shelf real estate with higher-margin, ready-to-eat convenience options. The shelf still looks full to a casual observer walking down the aisle, but the actual volume of affordable nourishment sitting on that shelf has plummeted. What makes this trend so critical right now is the hidden feedback loop inside modern retail algorithms. Big box distributors don't wait for a crisis to resolve itself. They react to shifting margins by quietly altering orders, paring down inventory commitments, and letting low-margin staples fade out of existence. By the time the average family realizes that their ultimate fallback protein has effectively doubled in cost per ounce, the underlying supply chain has already undergone a permanent structural reset. Over the course of this breakdown, we are going to expose all 15 of these vanishing staples, tracing each one back to its root cause, from drought-stricken pastures in the West to ocean trade routes in Asia and agricultural counties in Illinois and North Carolina. And we begin with the single item millions of households assumed was completely invincible, simply because it was the one thing that always felt safe when every other grocery option became unaffordable. Number 15. Canned chicken. To understand how the floor dropped out from under the canned food aisle, you have to dismantle the myth that this is a sudden crisis. What shoppers are witnessing on Walmart shelves in 2026 is the cumulative tipping point of structural decisions, legislative compromises, and environmental pressures that have been quietly compounding for over a decade. The modern food distribution grid was engineered for maximum efficiency on thin margins, assuming that weather patterns would remain predictable, energy costs stable, and feed supplies limitless. That underlying balance no longer exists. The historical trajectory of domestic protein pricing began to shift radically between 2021 and 2023, driven by a severe, multi-year drought across the American West and Southern Plains. Grazing lands in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska dried up, destroying pastures that supported the national cattle herd. As water access shrank and feed costs, specifically corn and soybean meal, surged, cattle ranchers faced an unsustainable balance sheet. Keeping breeding cows alive on purchased feed meant absorbing massive daily financial losses. Ranchers made the only rational economic move available. They liquidated their herds. Slaughterhouses saw record processing volumes of female breeding cattle throughout 2022. While that temporary surge in supply kept fresh beef prices manageable in the short term, it created a devastating demographic lag for the future. A beef cow has a long biological cycle. Gestation takes 9 months, and a calf requires an additional 18 to 24 months to reach market weight. Unlike poultry or pork, which can rebuild population numbers within months, rebuilding a decimated national cattle herd takes 4 to 6 years under optimal conditions. The United States Department of Agriculture documented domestic cattle inventories dropping to 60-year lows by early 2024. By 2025 and into 2026, the real impact hit the market. Whole-cut processors were forced to compete fiercely for a dramatically smaller pool of animals. In this bidding war, commercial canners lost. High-margin steakhouses and fresh meat distributors absorbed the higher live weight costs, passing them along to affluent consumers. Canners producing budget products like corned beef and beef stew could not absorb a 200% increase in raw input costs without pricing themselves entirely out of the budget aisle. Consequently, domestic producers began quietly stepping back from production, leaving a vacuum that opened the door for cheaper imports from South America, products often formulated with higher fat ratios and lower meat percentages to compensate for rising global shipping fees. Simultaneously, a parallel biological disruption hit the domestic poultry sector. Beginning in early 2022, highly pathogenic avian influenza, specifically the H5N1 strain, swept through commercial poultry operations across North America. Unlike previous seasonal outbreaks, this strain persisted across multiple years, mutating and spreading through wild bird migration corridors. Federal biosecurity mandates required the immediate depopulation of any farm testing positive. Tens of millions of birds were destroyed in single-season culls across major producing states like Georgia, Arkansas, and North Carolina. While public attention focused primarily on the spike in fresh egg prices, the commercial poultry meat supply chain suffered identical structural damage. Broiler operations faced repeated quarantine protocols, restocking delays, and skyrocketing insurance premiums. The cost of grain feed remained elevated due to global trade realignments and domestic fertilizer price spikes. When fresh poultry prices climbed, millions of low-income households shifted their purchasing habits toward canned chicken breast, treating it as an affordable, long-life protein source. Demand for canned chicken rose precisely when production volume hit a historic bottleneck. Large-scale food processors, faced with fixed retail price contracts with major big-box chains, responded not by openly doubling the price per can, but by adjusting net fill weights. Automated packing plants modified their volumetric dispensers, dropping standard can contents from 12.5 ounces down to 11, and eventually down to 10. The physical size of the steel can remained identical on the shelf, masking a net protein reduction of more than 10% per unit purchased. While domestic land-based agriculture wrestled with drought and disease, the aquatic supply chain faced its own systemic breakdown. Canned seafood, specifically tuna, salmon, sardines, and mackerel, has served as a foundational economic buffer for working-class families since the mid-20th century. However, oceanic supply lines operate under strict international quota regimes and immense logistics overhead. Consider the international sardine trade. Morocco controls more than 40% of the global canned sardine export market, supplying major retail chains across North America. Between 2023 and 2025, the Moroccan Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries implemented aggressive new catch limits in response to declining sea temperatures and changing pelagic fish migration patterns in the eastern Atlantic. Ocean fuel prices for commercial trawlers rose dramatically over the same period, while international ocean freight rates fluctuated wildly due to security risks in major marine transit corridors. By the time a crate of canned sardines landed at a port terminal in Long Beach or Savannah, the landed cost per unit had increased by 45% compared to 2020 baselines. Because the United States lacks a commercial domestic sardine fleet capable of offsetting international shortfalls, retail distributors had no choice but to adjust shelf allocations. Lower-cost imported North African brands were replaced by higher-priced store brand options or smaller packaging formats like rectangular foil pouches, which carry higher profit margins per ounce but offer significantly less food volume per dollar spent. This displacement triggered a cascade effect across the entire canned seafood aisle. As shoppers found canned tuna and sardines becoming prohibitively expensive, they shifted en masse to canned mackerel, an item that had historically sat undisturbed on bottom shelves with stable, low pricing. By mid-2025, demand for canned mackerel had surged by an estimated 30% nationwide. The marine supply chain, however, cannot scale up harvest volumes on demand. Overfishing regulations prevent fleets from increasing catch sizes past sustainable thresholds. As inventory cleared at unprecedented speeds, distributors adjusted wholesale pricing upward to slow down stock depletion. Within 12 months, the budget substitute followed the exact same inflationary curve as the primary product it was supposed to replace. The geographic trap had sprung. A global ocean supply chain, governed by natural biological limits and geopolitical shipping bottlenecks, could no longer support the emergency demand of millions of economically strained consumers. While macro-level agricultural and oceanic trends lay the foundation for this crisis, the immediate mechanism behind disappearing shelf space sits inside the corporate offices of major retail chains and food conglomerates. What is playing out across retail aisles in 2026 is a quiet, data-driven optimization strategy designed to protect profit margins at the direct expense of lower-income consumer security. When manufacturing and transportation costs surge, major brands enter contract renegotiations with big-box retailers like Walmart. In these negotiations, retail buyers operate under a strict algorithmic mandate: maintain target margins per square foot of shelf space or lose product placement. If a legacy brand cannot deliver a product that generates acceptable profit per linear inch, the retailer systematically reduces its display area, shifts it to less accessible top or bottom shelves, or eliminates it entirely in favor of private label alternatives. Consider the case of canned black beans and chickpeas. Both items historically served as dependable, low-cost plant proteins. However, between 2024 and 2026, domestic processing costs for dry legumes rose sharply due to localized drought conditions across the northern plains, combined with elevated natural gas prices required for industrial pressure cooking and canning operations. As raw input costs climbed, consumer demand surged simultaneously. Millions of households, priced out of fresh and canned meats, turned to dry and canned legumes as their primary daily protein staple. This created an operational clash. When demand spikes for a low-margin item, distributors face a double bind. Increasing production requires heavy capital investment in facility capacity, but the slim profit margin per unit makes that investment financially unviable. Retailers responded by executing an aggressive shelf real estate shift. Established national brands saw their canned legume allocations cut by up to 40%. In their place, store brand private labels expanded to fill the void. On paper, the shelf remained stocked. In reality, product diversity collapsed. Consumers who relied on specific sodium-free or organic formulations found those options missing, replaced by standardized, high-sodium store brand equivalents produced under volatile, short-term contract manufacturing agreements. An even more acute mechanism is visible in the canned tomato sector, specifically crushed, diced, and pureed tomatoes. California's Central Valley produces over 90% of domestic processing tomatoes. Over recent growing seasons, agricultural water allocations in California were severely restricted due to ongoing groundwater management regulations and volatile rainfall distribution. The price of irrigation water per acre-foot spiked, driving farm gate prices for processing tomatoes to record highs near $150 per ton. To compound the issue, tomato processing is uniquely energy-intensive. Tomatoes must be sorted, washed, steam-peeled, cooked down into paste or juice, and sealed in high-temperature sterilization cookers within hours of harvest to prevent spoilage. Energy tariffs for industrial facilities in California remained elevated throughout 2025 and 2026. Furthermore, global steel tariffs under Section 232 and Section 301 trade actions raised the baseline cost of tin plate steel containers by more than 18%. Because a simple can of tomatoes carries virtually no brand prestige, shoppers treat it as an interchangeable commodity. Manufacturers could not pass a 30% price increase directly to the retail sticker without seeing sales collapse. Instead, major food corporations altered the product formula. They increased water content, adjusted acidity levels with additives, and reduced the total solids percentage inside the can. A product that once contained dense, rich tomato pulp was reformulated into a watery puree, requiring home cooks to use 2 cans where 1 used to suffice. A parallel breakdown is unfolding in imported specialty staples, most notably canned coconut milk. The entire domestic supply of canned coconut milk is sea-freighted from Southeast Asia, primarily Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Over the past 24 months, ocean shipping lanes through the Red Sea and Suez Canal suffered sustained security disruptions, forcing container vessels to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. This added 10 to 14 days to transit times and increased fuel burn per voyage significantly. Ocean freight rates for 40-foot dry containers from Asian ports to U.S. West Coast terminals spiked from baseline levels under $2,000 to peak rates exceeding $5,000. For high-value electronics or apparel, an extra $3,000 per container represents a minor fractional cost increase. For a heavy, low-cost commodity like canned coconut milk, where a single shipping container holds thousands of heavy steel cans, the freight rate hike represented a crushing percentage increase on landed per-unit costs. Smaller import brands vanished from regional retail warehouses almost immediately as their operating margins turned negative. Major retail chains consolidated their supply contracts around single-source corporate suppliers capable of absorbing freight volatility. As a result, brand competition disappeared from the aisle. The retail shelf tag for canned coconut milk climbed quietly from $1.80 to over $2.30, accompanied by widespread stockouts as ocean transit delays created erratic 2 to 3 week supply gaps between distribution center shipments. The situation reaches its structural dead end in high-density, multi-ingredient emergency staples like canned beef stew and canned pumpkin. Canned pumpkin represents the extreme end of supply chain fragility. Nearly 95% of the entire national supply of processing pumpkin is grown and canned within a single 50-mile radius in Illinois. The harvest occurs within a narrow 6-week autumn window. If heavy rainfall or early frost impacts that specific geographic cluster during harvest, the entire nation's supply for the following 12 months is permanently reduced. There is no secondary reserve, no alternate geographic region, and no import backup for canned pumpkin. When weather disrupted the Midwestern harvest window, food distributors were forced to ration inventory across major retail customers for the entire calendar year. Retailers managed the shortage by eliminating promotional sales, raising baseline prices and allowing shelf space to sit empty for months at a time outside the primary holiday baking season. Every single link in the canned food aisle, from metal fabrication and farm gate harvests to ocean transit and retail algorithms, is operating at maximum strain. The buffer capacity that once allowed American supermarkets to offer cheap, abundant, shelf-stable food has been fully consumed. The system has reached a critical threshold where any minor disruption anywhere in the world immediately manifests as a permanent change on the local shelf.